Shalom and welcome to today's European report, filmed here in the European Parliament in the heart of the European Union. And in today's programme, we'll be looking at how Europe's going to look post-Brexit and also the up-and-coming European elections and what we can expect. So in today's programme, I'm joined by Tomas Sandell, the founder and director of the European Coalition for Israel, and Branislav Škripek, our Slovakian MEP, so welcome to the programme, and also Stephen Woolfe, who formerly of UKIP but now an independent MEP. Welcome to the programme. Thomas, so we're talking about the importance today of the European elections, and the European parliamentary elections will take place between the 23rd and the 26th of May, and a total of, I believe, 751 seats up for grabs, depending on whether Britain will field candidates or not, which represents 512 million people across the 28 member states. How significant are these elections, and what do they mean for supporters of Israel throughout the European Union?
Well, obviously these are very critical times that we are living in, maybe to some extent unprecedented after the war, when we look at the rise of anti-Semitism, when we look at the unrest, the social unrest in many of our major democracies, the polarization, the disunity. If the citizens are not alert and active and engaged, we know from recent history what can happen, even in the most civilized continent like Europe. So having said this, it goes without further explanation that these elections are very, very critical. I've been here for 25 years in some capacity, in and around the European institutions. I've never sensed a time similar to this one, which I feel is so critical. Let me just say that 2 weeks ago, I visited Auschwitz-Birkenau for the first time ever, and obviously this raises many questions for someone like myself. But one thing that I realized coming out, and I wrote on my Facebook update, I said, you know, God created man, man created hell. Man is able to create the worst of circumstances. So it also means that the responsibility for us as fallen men, as we would say in Christian theology, is also to make sure that history is not repeated.
Absolutely.
And I don't think anyone can overemphasize how important this is.
And Stephen, it's an absolute pleasure for us to have you on today's European report. You know, your statement on your website is inspirational, where you talk about your upbringing and your background, and I recommend any of our viewers to actually go to Stephen's website and actually read it for themselves. But Stephen, you were tipped to succeed Nigel Farage, and many would argue it's a shame that you didn't succeed him. But in terms of you are no longer associated with UKIP, why did you decide to leave and become an independent? And my second part of the question is, are you preparing yourself to stand in the forthcoming election if the British government has to contend the European elections?
I think the truth, I'll be very quick about the past in UKIP. It was very clear to me that having been attacked by somebody within my own party, and the party, in my view, and what I was being told, was going to create some form of whitewash in which the blame of it was going to be either equally shared or blamed on myself. I couldn't stand by in a political party and do that. I abhor the idea of violence in particular circumstances and in politics. When violence becomes so prominent within a particular party and a movement, then you end up with a situation where you lead to leaders that lead to Auschwitz. So I'm not suggesting for a moment that UKIP would have gone down that line, but even the acceptance of it wasn't acceptable to myself. And secondly, I did feel that those who were trying to oust me were trying to move in a direction of politics within their party where there are concerns about certain aspects of the Islam religion, FGM, or the support of Islamic terrorism. But at no stage could you completely blame the whole of that religion or all its supporters for all the ills of that. As you saw on my website, my grandmother is Jewish, and I have another grandmother who's Irish Catholic. During the IRA's situation going on in Britain, when we had a bomb in Manchester that blew us up, are we to blame my grandmother for the impact of those terrorists? So neither can we do the same on those who are genuine Islamic believers we must target ourselves those who are the Islamic terrorists, those who promote the ideology, and the financiers in countries outside of the European Union that are funding them.
Absolutely.
So moving forward, we are in the European Union. If Britain decides to stay in an extended situation where we are forced into a European election, the only political party that could be capable of myself standing, so far as I can see, is Nigel Farage's Brexit party. I haven't had discussions with them of that. There are plenty of people within his own camp and outside who would like me to stand. I'm a bit dubious about it myself. Part of it is because I genuinely believe that coming here and campaigning to leave the European Union was the main reason for me being here. And if we have not left the European Union, then perhaps I'm being a little bit disingenuous coming back. But over the weekend and at various events during the course of the last week, lots of people have said, Stephen, you can't. If the opportunity comes, you must try and stand, because your voice is one that represents millions of us who would lose that voice here. And
Absolutely.
with that in my ear, then I will keep the options open.
Excellent, thank you. And Branislav, it's fantastic to have you back on the programme. And can I just say that over the years, you've really grown in stature as an MEP and a supporter of Israel and supporting Christians in this parliament as well. So thank you for that. And we also pray and hope that you'll be standing in the forthcoming elections and get re-elected, which is the most important thing.
Thank you.
But Branislav, political analysts are saying that in the next parliament, we are going to see the biggest shift in the European Parliament's history, more to the right and more nationalist groups. Can you tell us why you think that this will happen?
I think an answer is not very difficult, and partially it's something which UKIP was doing and pronouncing in European Parliament. Too much federalism, too much stressing the notion of one united European nations, kind of USA or European, United European nations or states.
Yeah.
And simply this notion brings too much fears into the many people who are in a new way coming to understand why it is important to be a citizen who decides. I speak much more from the point of view of used to be a former Soviet Union, satellite nation, and it was so difficult to understand any democracy. And simply my parents had to go to election day, and they had to vote for Communist Party. There was no other option. They were compelled. If they would not go, there would be a punishment. There would be a great problem. But now, a new freedom came, and after a short time of enjoying freedom in our East European countries or Central European countries, we joined the European Union, and feelings of the very same something. There is a great cover over us, and we gave a part of our sovereignty to someone else. Now, too many citizens also feel detached from any influence on politics, and because of the big faces of European Union, the representative of biggest nations here, our states here, simply are dreaming about federalist government.
Yep.
The smaller nations don't feel very good, and the parties, like very nationalistic party, very right-wing party, or very extreme left-wing parties, simply stand up and giving very simple sayings, very simple handouts like we can do, we can leave, we can do the same as Brits did. But I don't think this is a very good way. I am Euro-realistic, and I think we rather need to come back to a cooperation between nations, being a community rather than union. And I think the change of these two created a problem. I'm not very happy that Britain leaves, because we could be a community of nations who help each other. So if we would rather to make in our nation strong values, which are positive toward the citizens, the nation will be stronger and the European Union can be stronger. So I think strong values can bring stronger nations and strong EU as in cooperation.
Excellent, thank you. And Thomas, if Britain is due to leave the European Union, and the question marks are certainly over that at the moment, this would be the first European elections taking place in the post-Brexit era. And also we see that we could have a more Eurosceptic parliament here with more nationalistic, anti-federalist parties in this parliament. What do you think that will mean for Israel? What do you think that will mean for the European Parliament? And what do you think this will have on the EU Commission itself? Long question, I know.
Yeah, well, there were several questions in one. So let me say one, going back to Auschwitz, it's interesting how the conclusions that the Europeans made from Auschwitz are completely different from what the Jewish people did. Let me explain. Auschwitz for the Jewish people was the lowest point in their history. As Ben-Gurion explained in 1942, he said the worst thing that happened was that Jews were slaughtered, they had no flag, they had no country, they had no rifles. So out of the ashes of the Holocaust comes the Jewish state in 1948. So nationalism is the answer to the Auschwitz, to the greatest horror of evil that mankind has perhaps seen in Europe. For the European Union, it's the opposite. Out of the ashes of Holocaust comes this idea of, well, first it was a European community, but as we hear from the discussion now, it's much more than that, a federated Europe with much less influence on the nation state. So I think these are two very different paradigms. And what we see happening actually in some parts of Europe, take Poland, Hungary, you know, the Visegrad 4 nations in particular, is that there are those who say, you know, listen, we are not quite ready to go as far as the political establishment in Brussels is expecting of us. And, you know, that will go back to UKIP and to the British Brexit. And I think this is a chance where the political establishment here can put the ears to the ground and listen and take note and adapt. Or they can ignore everything and we'll be back to where we were 30 years ago. If we'd met in March 1989 and we'd said, what will the world be like in 1 year from now? We said, well, of course we know what it will be like. Nobody had an idea, none of the experts. And this was when the Iron Curtain came down. So we have a completely new situation, and I think that I would say the Europe that I would want to see is similar to what Branislav said. You know, a Europe of strong values, of strong families, of strong nations, and we need to build this from the not from the top down, but from the down up, it remains to be seen if the political leadership of Europe is listening enough to its citizen and is adapting to what we hear from so many corners of Europe right now.
Excellent. And Stephen, I'm going to go slightly off script and ask you about your thoughts on what President Macron has said as of the recording of this programme, that Brexit is the biggest threat to happen to Europe since the Second World War. And in your opinion, what does Brexit mean for this whole European project? And particularly what's happening in Britain and now where there is so much opposition to Brexit in our parliament?
I think what President Macron said in his statement to Europe was the echoes of something deeply dangerous and deeply concerning. It's deeply concerning because he seems to have adopted this stance that I am the president of Europe rather than the European Union. It's deeply dangerous because, as we said here so far, there are massive concerns across the whole of the European Union within its members, those who are supportive of the European Union as a concept and those who are not, that believe there should be a family of nations, not that of a unified nation state. And it's deeply dangerous because he promotes in that speech a European Union nationalism. And within that, we already know we have mass protests outside Westminster with the flags of the European Union, huge flags, hundreds of them, promoted out there. We know that we have a national anthem here, and we're now supporting that of a European Union army. And whenever you have a European Union army in this formation of a nationalism, you have to seek an enemy. And at the moment, you can see that the enemy is Russia and China. And also, to some extent, you've heard some politicians talking about the United States as an enemy, an economic enemy. So we need to protect ourselves. That is not a Europe that is seeking to reach out and be friendly and promote values. That is an insuralism. That is a creation of this own country backed by a number of people. And one of the final points that was equally concerning within his statement, which backs up why I believe that Britain should leave, is his idea that he has to institute new committees or new groups. And one of those was a committee made up only of experts that can decide whether elections are fair and what statements made in those elections are fair. Now, I read that in 1984 when we had Big Brother. Branislav faced that when his family were told who to vote for. We still see that to the extent in a China that dictates a form of elections. It's deeply damaging, and I think this will go down very badly with the electorate.
And Branislav, when we look at Europe today, and particularly in light of President Macron's comments that Brexit represents the biggest threat to Europe since the end of World War II, isn't there a danger as Europe moves closer to political integration that they're not taking into account the views of the ordinary people across Europe moving closer and closer to European superstate, and therefore isn't there a great danger that we are already seeing today in Europe a rise of neo-Nazi parties that hold dangerously anti-Semitic views and views on racism, that these parties could become dominant parties across Europe if the will of the people is not taken in regards or into account?
Yeah, I think this is the problem, that I don't see an admonition or a lesson taken from Brexit. Me personally, I do not see that here in Brussels, a big heads did really taken any lesson and try to do any change. Do you remember we had these 5 scenarios offered? But finally, a 6th one came with Mr. Juncker simply saying more Europe. Bigger, I mean, kind of united government, kind of let's do more and more union. Finally, after they said, Commission said that there was hundreds of discussions in all the nations of the Europe. Probably, I didn't notice too many in Slovakia, but some. But generally, we only spoke about the 5 scenarios. We only had discussion like which one is not good. But finally, we had in Strasbourg Mr. Juncker expressing the 6th one, the best one, being more Europe, more unified Europe again. So now the Britons is leaving, and I don't think there was any lesson taken for a change. But that's why the parties, very nationalistic parties, gaining stronger stand, especially in Slovakia. I see that there is a kind of fascist party which says slow exit, and they are gaining popularity. They are growing in numbers for national elections only, and I don't think they would cross a great threshold, become very, very strong. But they are sending messages. They are even trying to candidate to EP, which I don't understand why, what they want to do here. But this is the point for me. We didn't take any lesson from Brexit.
And Tomas, you know, regardless of our views on Europe across Europe, isn't it important that we engage with the European institutions? And what advice do you have for our viewers who will be voting in May and who will determine the direction that this Parliament takes over the course of the next 5 years?
Yeah, it's you know, we can be critical of many things that we see here in Europe. I think just to balance things up from my side, there are many things that we are extremely grateful for. I mean, to be able to have this discussion here in the European Parliament and to have a diversity of views. So regardless of what happens here, our commitment as European Coalition for Israel is to stay involved. And I think this is a sound Christian commitment to say, you know, come whatever, we need to be involved, you know, through prayer, through education, through advocacy. So this is why we will launch a campaign in just a few days from now called Pray and Vote, calling upon all the Christians in Europe to get engaged in the elections, to pray for the elections, but also to vote. Because what we've seen from statistics is that there are so many Christians who simply don't think that it matters to go to the polls and be involved in the political process. And I think this is very, very dangerous. So we would like to first, together with respected Christian leaders in Europe, and we've been working with Branislav on this, get the message across, remember to vote, remember to vote. But we will also obviously inform where the different parties stand on particular issues related to Israel and the Jewish people. So I think it's in the interest, in the common interest, that people really know who they are voting for. But for us, it's very clear. We can be critical. You know, this is how a democracy works. We can be critical, but we need to engage and we need to vote.
Excellent. And Stephen, I suppose I have to ask the very crucial question from your inside view is, do you think that Brexit's going to happen? And what are the lessons that other nations can learn from Britain's experience, particularly if we have a hard Brexit and we come out of Europe without a deal?
I don't think Brexit's going to happen. If you have Theresa May's withdrawal deal voted through, which is likely, that isn't Brexit. That's simply what I call soft remain. We leave the institutions, but effectively we're tied to the European Union and all the rules, laws and regulations going forward. So you don't become a true independent nation. We're still tied to the ECJ. We still have to make decisions on our laws based on what the European Union has already done. And that inability to be able to go off and have regulatory divergence means that we are effectively a rule taker without actually participating. And that will set a hugely damaging position in the United Kingdom for our democracy. We're already seeing that the left-right division is breaking down between a Remainer and Leaver. And I think that's difficult. And one of the things that I would say from that is it could send out some really negative messages. I do want to touch upon this point about the European political parties. I actually think that the Eurosceptics gaining ground in the European Union will be positive for democracy here, because it could do the thing that Branislav has actually been saying for a while. It might actually make them stop and think. But I also believe it'd be good for Israel. If you exclude Jobbik, for example, and Golden Dawn, almost all the Eurosceptic parties, from Marine Le Pen's ENF to the FPO to Fidesz and even UKIP, are incredibly pro-Israel. And one thing I've sensed in this parliament is that the left have become less supportive of Israel. And if you take a look at now what's happening in the United Kingdom and in the Democratic Party, there is no doubt that the left has been infiltrated heavily by those who are anti-Semitic. Now, I don't believe Jeremy Corbyn is anti-Semitic in any way, but there are many in his party who are. But if you take a look at Ilhan Omar in the Democratic Party, and I quote, I want to say this: I should not be expected to have allegiance or pledge support to a foreign country in order to serve my country. That sentence from a newly elected Democratic congressman is a dog whistle to those who are saying that Israel is running the world. It's in the Democratic Party, it's in the Labour Party, it's in the socialist parties throughout many of our countries, and the Eurosceptics could come back and actually create a buffer and protect Christianity and Judaism and Israel in the European Parliament if they are successful in these elections.
Excellent. And finally, Branislav, I'll give you the last say of the programme. How important is it that our viewers get behind and support you, and particularly in your own country as well, that they support a brave and courageous MEP like yourself, who is wanting to be re-elected and standing for Israel and the Jewish people in the Parliament here?
So this is something I would like to see a support, and I try to pronounce to wherever people, to many people wherever I go for discussions, that we need to have our representation in the European Parliament. Regarding Israel, I know many churches in Europe which pray for the protection of Israel. I know many people who really stand for Israel, but also Israel as a country needs a political representation. And this is crucial, that people who pray for Israel will understand we need to go to election boxes.
Absolutely.
And we need to speak for those people who stand for Israel. So to give a vote is something giving us a mandate to represent and speak, because if there is no peace in Jerusalem and in Israel, no peace in the world.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you all for being my guests on today's programme. And I just want to thank you for watching today's European Report, filmed here in the European Parliament in the heart of Europe. And as many of you across Europe will go to vote, make sure you look at the values, make sure you look at the parties, make sure you know who you're actually voting for in this forthcoming European election. So thank you for watching today's programme.